To claim otherwise is wrong, and I reserve the ballots.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, could I inquire how much time is on both sides?
The gentleman from Arizona has 9.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Washington has 5.5 minutes remaining.
I will advise my friend that at this point I have no more requests for time, and I am prepared to close if the gentleman is prepared to close.
I have no further speakers. Here, read this and then go. I have one.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Yes. I want to our respected chairman. The chairman is correct. The Natural Resources Committee, of which I am a proud member, appears to be very busy passing bills. But let's be clear. The Republican majority, time and time again, acts unilaterally, alone, without meaningful cooperation with the minority in those legislations, and in the House, and with the Senate, and with the administration. On suspensions, the majority insists on ridiculous limitations that prevent consideration of many measures designed to conserve lands. And, of course, they insist on more than 3-to-1 ratio of their legislation to the minority's legislation to ours. No wonder the number of suspension is lagging behind what we had done in the past. As to the bills we have considered under a rule, most of them are almost identical repeats of the bills that were passed in the House last Congress, but because they were opposed by the Senate and the administration, they went nowhere. To keep passing the same dead-on-arrival bills over and over again to make the committee look busy it should not be mistaken for legislating. The idea is to work on legislation that can bring bills of a bipartisan nature that the Senate will deal with, and more importantly, that the administration will sign. That's the legislation my side of the aisle looks forward to working on, and in a very serious manner, improving the operation of Interior, improving the operation of our public lands, and creating transparency at all levels. We want to do that, and we look forward to working with the majority and with our esteemed chairman in that direction. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remainder of our time.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, was very pleased when I heard my good friend from Arizona congratulate the work of the committee until I heard his explanation of what the committee did, and then I had to have a bit of a caution there. I just want to point out that when the gentleman complains about the ratio of majority and minority, we are following precisely the same example when roles were reversed. In other words, when the Democrats were in majority, the minority, when we were in the minority, we had the same ratio. So we're following that pretty much to the same, and that's been the tradition in this House for a long period of time. The difference, however, I would say, Mr. Chairman, is that the committee has been much more productive when we've been in control, meaning that there has been more legislation moving that the Democrats would like. But I want to make this point also. There is Democrat and Republican suspension bills that are both sitting in the Senate that haven't been acted on. And I think that the Senate needs to act on those pieces of legislation. Mr. Chairman, this is an important piece of legislation, and all of these titles have passed out of the committee and were amalgamated here. But they had all been acted on. They all had input in subcommittee in some way or the other within the committee. And so I wanted to make that point. This is not legislation that was pulled out of the air. It was legislation that was deliberated upon within the committee. And I also want to mention, even though the statement of administration policy was negative in some parts of the bill, there is no veto threat by the administration on this piece of legislation. They expressed concerns, as is understandable on certain parts of it. I understand that. But there is no veto threat at all whatsoever in what the administration has said. And finally, let me make this observation, and we hear this over and over and over, especially as it relates to the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that NEPA certainly has its place within our statutes and how we conduct policy, particularly on public lands. But here's where we part company, Mr. Chairman. We part company because my friends on the other side of the aisle always advocate that even before Congress acts, NEPA should be the judge of whatever that action is. Now, I have to tell you, Mr. Chairman, I think that is contrary to what our role is here. Congress created NEPA, meaning that Congress is the one that decides what the law of the land is. Within these bills, we are deciding what the law of the land is, and NEPA should not get in front of our actions. But to hear my friends on the other side of the aisle argue, they are saying over and over and over again that NEPA should be between Congress acting on a law. Wait a minute. We are putting regulations before Congress should be doing their constitutional duty in enacting statutes? I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I part company with that philosophy, yet that is exactly what we hear over and over and over from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We are the ones that's given by the Constitution to make statutes, and we believe that that should be the law, and then regulations follow, not the other way around. But that is what we hear over and over and over again. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a good piece of legislation. As I mentioned, it addresses areas that are certain parochial in certain parts of the country. As my colleague from Utah said, all the way from Florida to Alaska. I think it's responsible legislation, and I think it deserves our support. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. It shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-35. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part A of House Report 113-340. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report. Shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mr. Grijalva of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My amendment is straightforward. It strikes Title 4 of the bill. Title 4 is the text of H.R. 2095, introduced by my friend from Utah, Chairman of the Public Lands Subcommittee, Mr. Bishop. The title would prohibit BLM from acquiring additional land until the agency creates a publicly accessible database that inventories current land holdings and identifies land suitable for disposal. Much of the bill we are considering today seeks to undermine the public planning process and give away federal land free of charge. This land belongs to the American people, and if we are going to be in the business of giving it away, we should at least not hinder our ability to acquire more land when it makes sense to do so. Let me see if I understand it. I do not oppose the idea of creating a database that catalogs federal land holdings. I do not oppose the idea of transparency at BLM or any other government agency for that matter, but putting an arbitrary condition on land acquisition authority is just bad policy. The true intent of the title is not to create a database. The intent is to limit land acquisition. The majority has been clear about their agenda to limit expansion of the federal estate, and the bill we are considering today is just another attempt to advance that priority. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Through the Public Land Through the public land use planning process, BLM keeps an inventory of its land. Land managers, from the folks down the street in the Department of Interior building to the field staff all over the country, know how much land the federal government owns. In fact, the Federal Land and Policy Management Act, also known as the BLM's Organic Act, provides clear direction and authority for cataloging and the inventory of federal lands. FLPMA also provides the agency with authority to dispose of lands deemed worthy or disposal through the public planning process. Like I mentioned before, I don't see a problem with creating a database of information available in BLM's resource management plans. The problem is with limiting authority for land acquisition. Land acquisition authority makes the management of federal lands more efficient. It's not the boogeyman that the sponsors of the bill claim. Federal land managers acquire land in order to clean up the checkerboard pattern of ownership, consolidating federal holdings, and making them easier to manage. Limiting the authority will have the consequence of making the management of federal lands more difficult and less efficient. Land is also acquired when it makes sense for conservation and resource management purposes. The federal government is a steward of some of our nation's most pristine and treasured resources. There are times when it makes sense to add to national parks or national monuments to make sure that they have the resources and the protection that they merit. Popular programs like the Land and Water Conservation Fund have helped conserve millions of acres that provide all of our constituents with opportunities to hike, hunt, fish, and pursue other recreational activities. If we have to ensure that efficient management of federal land, but limiting land acquisition authority is a step in the wrong direction. My amendment makes sure that this important tool is not jeopardized, and I urge my colleagues to support its adoption. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what
Reserve.
purposes?
Mr. Speaker,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
wish to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate very much the gentleman from Arizona. I do enjoy working with him on the subcommittee in a very way, and I have to admit, at this stage of the game, I am a little bit perplexed about the amendment. The gentleman purports saying that the idea of transparency and keeping a database is not a bad idea. He just objects to the enforcement mechanism we put in there. If that were the case, I would wonder why he didn't just strike the enforcement mechanism out or come up with a substitute enforcement mechanism. I am not bound to this particular one. Had there been a date certain or some other ideas, I may even have accepted that as a friendly approach to try and help this particular title. But instead, the amendment strikes everything. It strikes the very essence of forcing them to actually come up with a database that is there. During the Clinton administration, and that's been a while ago, the Interior Department did come up with a database of lands that were available for disposal, that were needless, that were useless for the government. We have the data. The only problem is it's almost impossible to get to the data. The data is found in books in over 150 different local offices. It would take a huge road trip to try and come up with just the information. This is now 2014. The idea that the BLM cannot actually put this data on a website that is available to everybody is quite frankly not acceptable. That they are too busy to do this is simply not acceptable. All this says is the data is there. Put the data on a website so it is transparent and is viewable for everybody to see. And then we said, since there is a whole lot of dragging their feet since the Clinton administration in trying to do this, we'll give you some incentive. You can't buy new land until you put on the website so people can see what land is available for disposal. Does not stop them from managing the land for multiple use or non-multiple use or for any other reason. It simply gives them an incentive to go ahead and do it. Like I said, if your goal was to change the incentive, I would have been amenable to discussions on that. I will still be amenable to discussions on that. But this amendment strikes the entire thing, not just the enforcement provision. For that reason, I would oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we're also talking, in my amendment, we're also talking about the federal government having the authority to buy land from willing sellers. And when you bar the federal government from trying to buy land, then what happens? The seller still wants to sell, so who steps up? Developers, other high-intensity uses around areas that should be protected. When you look at Uncle Sam as a buyer for political purpose, you empower developers and others that want the land for completely different uses. And before you know it, an area that you wanted to conserve and preserve is gone. This is bad policy, and to remove the authority from the federal government of being able to purchase land from willing sellers, I think is a step too far. And with that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia to show how this amendment would impact the Chesapeake Bay area.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment and speak in support of H.R. 2954, the Public Access and Lands Improvement Act. And I wish to extend my thanks to Chairman Doc Hastings for his leadership in bringing this important package of bills from the Natural Resources Committee to the House floor. And today, I want to highlight how this legislation will aid in the cleanup of one of our prized historic resources, the Chesapeake Bay. This body of water provides habitat for plants and animals, resources that drive local economies, recreation, and a way of life for many that live on and around its shores. I'm the proud author of Title 10 of this bill, the Chesapeake Bay Accountability and Recovery Act. These provisions would implement and strengthen management techniques like cross-cut budgeting and adaptive management to ensure we get more bang for our buck and continue to make progress in Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts. These techniques will assure that we are coordinating how restoration dollars are spent and making sure that everyone understands how individual projects fit into the bigger picture. That way we're not duplicating efforts, spending money we don't need to, or worse, working at cross purposes. During the 112th Congress, the House passed similar legislation as part of H.R. 2578, the Conservation and Economic Growth Act. More recently, identical language was adopted by voice vote and included in the House version of the Farm Bill. These provisions would implement and strengthen management techniques to ensure, again, we get more bang for our buck and progress in the Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts continue and are measurable. Cross-cut budgeting and adaptive management and an independent evaluator should be key components for the complex restoration efforts for our Chesapeake Bay. And I encourage my colleagues to join with me and support H.R. 2954. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Is there any time remaining, or is the gentleman?
The gentleman is yielded back.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
On that, I would ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, for the proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed.
Thank you.
It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part A of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Speaker.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mrs. Lummis of Wyoming.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 472, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Lummis, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I'm offering this amendment with Representative Labrador after discussions with our local agriculture producers and the Public Lands Council on some needed adjustments to the underlying bill. This amendment includes some conforming language to the Senate version of the Grazing Improvement Act that was marked up in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee last November. This includes allowing the Secretary to consolidate environmental reviews of allotments in order to reduce the backlog on permit and lease renewals. The amendment clarifies the definition of current grazing management to the common sense wording of the terms and conditions of an existing permit or lease. It also clarifies that only those directly affected by the renewal, transfer, or reissuance of a permit or lease may appeal a final grazing decision. Lastly, this amendment addresses some concern about how the federal land agencies treat temporary crossings and trailing. While the underlying bill exempts all crossing and trailing of domestic livestock from the National Environmental Policy Act, this amendment clarifies that temporary applications and those where an immediate need exists will receive a timely response from the agency. It also states that these authorizations are not subject to protest or appeal except by affected parties. Our producers' normal business operations require the ability to cross and trail livestock. It is often necessary to remain in compliance with their grazing permits. Temporary trailing has a de minimis impact on the range, and approval should be an administrative action with a quick turnaround time. Weather, changes in grazing patterns, and even requests by federal land agencies can all require trailing unexpectedly. For example, a hailstorm can wipe out a stand of grass in an hour. A devastating grasshopper infestation can change the grazing conditions on the ground. And those kind of things require quick response to get cattle or sheep to a different pasture to keep that grass stand healthy. We need to provide the flexibility for our federal land agencies to approve temporary requests. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support the Lummis-Labrador amendment and the underlying bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance. Reserves the gentleman from Arizona's for what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment attempts to conform with the Senate language related to the Grazing Improvement Act, but two wrongs don't necessarily make a right. The language is still problematic. I thank the sponsor for this amendment and for this opportunity to talk a little bit more about public land grazing. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, Title VIII attempts to address one issue related to public lands grazing, the backlog of permit renewals, but it fails to take on the larger issue of below-market grazing fees. The federal government charges $1.35 per month per animal unit on federal lands. If we are going to consider legislation that waives NEPA and extends the tenure of grazing permits almost doubles the number of years, we also have to review the formula for grazing fees. The state of Idaho charges $12 to $14 per month to graze on state lands. In Arizona, we charge $8 to $9 per month. Washington State charges $12 per month. Nevada, $12.50 per month. California, over $16 per month. We often hear from the majority that the states do a better job of managing their lands, and in this case, I would agree. The states do a better job of making sure their taxpayers get a fair return on the use of their state lands, while federal taxpayers are stuck subsidizing the practice of grazing on public lands. With that, sir, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the chairman of our Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, 30 seconds.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I support this amendment. I think what in the brief part of this debate here, it points out the importance of having flexibility on the local level rather than having a one-size-fits-all, because there are conditions that can come up in grazing in various states, and those managers need that flexibility, which I think is a common thread that we talk about all the time when we talk about federal land management. So I think this amendment adds very much to the Labrador title of the bill, and with that I tend to support it, and I yield back to the gentlelady.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
We have no other speakers, and in closing, let me yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, in closing, I would like to point out something about the difference between state lands and federal lands. I ran my state's Office of State Lands and Investments for a time, and the rights that are conveyed by states on lands to use their lands are very different than the rights that are conveyed by the federal government to users of federal lands. In the case of state lands, frequently they have many more rights, including in some states the right to exclude others. They have the rights to make improvements on the ground. They have the rights to acquire water permits. They have no NEPA requirements that are specific to the state land and other opportunities to, in fact, even sublease their lands. And those vary from state to state. States that grant more rights can acquire more revenue because that gives more flexibility to the person who is grazing. In the case of the federal government, there are burdensome regulations, there are third-party challenges, there's compliance issues, it's more of a command and control structure. So it's just not worth as much financially because of the tremendous paperwork and burden involved. Therefore, there's reasons for those differences. Mr. Chairman, the amendments we're proposing have nothing to do with that, but offer common-sense solutions to some very important grazing issues. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time's expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Wyoming. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho seek recognition?
An amendment at the desk.
The clerk would designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mr. Labrador of Idaho.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment of Title 8 of H.R. 2954, which I originally introduced as H.R. 657, the Grazing Improvement Act. My amendment is a common-sense reform to require groups who are not substantially justified or directly affected by final federal grazing decisions to pay for the legal expenses of the other party when they lose in court. In short, this is a loser-pays system to discourage frivolous legal challenges to federal land management grazing decisions. Current law gives grazing permittees the right to a hearing in connection with grazing decisions and gives the interested public the opportunity to participate in the way federal land is managed. However, it is doubtful that Congress ever intended to elevate the interested public to a level of equal standing to that of grazing permittees. In 1995, the Bureau of Land Management established grazing regulations that far surpassed the intent of Congress. Some were given the ability to participate in the administrative appeals process, allowing them to sue if the non-permittees disagreed with a final grazing decision. Since then, environmental groups have been increasingly effective at abusing the current appeals process not to promote environmental health, but for the sole reason of removing livestock from federal lands. Each year, hundreds of appeals are filed on grazing decisions by groups. The cost to ranchers can hardly be measured. In a recent case in Wyoming, for example, an appeal cost a small group of ranchers over $125,000 in administrative appeal and attorney's fees alone. My amendment simply addresses this growing problem by clarifying the intent of Congress on who may appeal and litigate a final agency decision on a final grazing decision. It is time we ease the burden of environmental groups have placed on our ranchers. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yield?
I do.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I think that the gentleman's amendment to this piece of legislation is an important policy step. In fact, I think in many cases loser pay ought to apply to a much larger area. And I know that the gentleman's amendment only deals with grazing, but the example he cited in Wyoming, where it costs somebody $125,000, and with the volatility of the markets, that's a big expense on individuals. And I think this will help curb that in the future. So I congratulate the gentleman for his amendment, and I tend to support it, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman
reserves. I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona, for what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment very simply seeks to limit, if not eliminate, judicial review on those who have an interest in grazing on our public lands. This amendment attempts to, with incentives, negative incentives to the public, limit the public from challenging federal action on grazing decisions by making them pay the prevailing party's legal fees. Like I mentioned before, all federal taxpayers are on the hook for subsidizing grazing on federal lands. Therefore, all citizens of this country should have the opportunity to challenge the decisions that have effect on their public lands. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I agree that everyone should have a right to sue, but if you lose, I think you should pay. And this amendment will allow federal land managers to get back to managing lands, create greater certainty in the ranching community, and help strengthen rural economies in the West. This minor reform will save taxpayer dollars and countless hours and dollars spent by ranchers who are forced to defend against these nuisance suits. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, grazing on public land, grazing has impacts on public lands like no other use, and it's important that we consider these impacts through the NEPA process and through judicial review, both that are being struck from that process today. You know, steamrolling and eliminating judicial review and the public process as in reference to East Germany and centralized government and thought control. Once we begin to limit the public and the individual's access to redress through the courts by action of this Congress, it is a dangerous, not only precedent, but a dangerous step in public transparency, but more important, in the public's right to know. And with that, I reserve the balance of our time. I yield back the remainder of our time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Idaho. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed
Mr. Speaker.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Idaho will be postponed. Now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part A of House Report 113-340. For what purpose the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mr. McClintock of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, last August, the Rim Fire destroyed 400 square miles of timber in the Sierra Nevada. It left behind hundreds of millions of board feet of dead timber that can still be salvaged. But as I pointed out earlier, time's of the essence. Within a year, the fire-killed timber loses much of its value. Yet the current environmental review process takes a year to complete, and then litigation starts and runs out the clock on what remains of that perishable resource. 16,000 acres of the destroyed timbers on private land owned by Sierra Pacific Industries. It does not face the bureaucratic obstacles that we face on the public land. SPI is already halfway through its salvage. It will be completed by summer. They'll use a portion of those proceeds to replant their devastated acreage. But meanwhile, the timber on the public land continues to rot and decay. The earliest the Forest Service can conclude its environmental review is August, and then the litigation process will start, and then it will be too late. The cost will be hundreds of jobs, millions of dollars of lost economic activity, millions of dollars of lost salvage revenues that could otherwise be used by the federal government for reforestation of the public lands. Now, Title IX of the bill in its current form was based on bipartisan language introduced by Senator Tom Daschle to expedite salvage in the Black Hills National Forest. But these provisions were opposed from the other side of the aisle. So I sat down with the Forest Service and opposition offices to work out a process that will assure that salvage can begin by spring while maintaining both environmental and judicial review. And I particularly want to thank Chief Tom Tidwell for his technical assistance and that of his office. This amendment is the product of these talks. It authorizes the Forest Service to select acreage for salvage where there's no wilderness, ESA, historic, or other legal restrictions. It authorizes them to implement the draft EIS that's expected to be completed by April and deems the draft as compliant with all applicable environmental reviews. This will allow salvage to begin under their direction in April. It authorizes the Forest Service to modify the draft EIS in response to public comment and allows for judicial review of the final EIS based on ecological impacts. It merely bars litigation based on process, and it bars temporary restraining orders. This will allow the timely salvage of a portion of the public lands destroyed by the fire while the final EIS is prepared and while any judicial review proceeds. And finally, it authorizes the Forest Service to use the millions of dollars raised by the salvage for forest restoration in the devastated Sierra. This compromise language assures compliance with all environmental laws and maintains judicial review while assuring that salvage can begin this spring. That's also important to the economy of the region that's been devastated by the fire and by increasingly stringent federal restrictions and land acquisitions that have ravaged the timber, livestock, mineral, and tourist industries upon which these mountain communities depend. It means jobs for hundreds of lumberjacks, mill workers, truckers, and all those who support them. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman yield before he resigns?
Yes, I'll yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I just want to say that I think this amendment adds to what he is attempting to do, because the issue of salvaging and the timeliness of that is something that is lost on a lot of people. So I congratulate the gentleman for not only for the title in the bill but for the amendment, and I intend to support it, and I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the rim fire burned over 200,000 acres in California's Sierra Nevada mountains in August of last year, Mr. McClintock has expressed an interest in expediting salvage logging operations in the burned area. The language he has offered to achieve this goal keeps evolving, in my opinion, keeps getting better. Unfortunately, I still cannot support this amendment, the latest version of H.R. 3188. Since the fire, the Forest Service has engaged in an extensive planning effort that includes salvage operations where they are deemed appropriate. The planning effort is ongoing, and the amendment seeks to force a decision before it's complete. The amendment references a proposed action that predates the issuance of the draft environmental impact statement. The draft EIS is due out in April. Until then, we should allow the public process to end before backing the Forest Service into a corner with a mandated decision. Otherwise, we take away the opportunity for public input and the ability for the Forest Service to examine the economic feasibility of salvage operations, potential damage to wildlife, and other consequences. CEQ has already approved an expedited process for the EIS that includes a shortened timeline for the comment period and eliminates notification requirements. The Forest Service is committed to this expedited process and working diligently to advance appropriate restoration. The amendment still mandates salvage logging in areas where it might not be appropriate while waiving federal environmental standards. Taking NEPA out of the picture will not end up in more logging or less lawsuits. Supporters of this amendment understand that this is the case. That's why the amendment waives a bevy of other environmental laws, including the Endangered Species Act. The forests of Sierra Nevada provide Californians with clean water, fish, wildlife, habitat, and recreation. Indiscriminate salvage logging threatens these treasured forests. Additionally, the amendment limits judicial and administrative review. This is still a huge sticking point. Salvage logging is extremely controversial, and we shouldn't take away any tools available for the public to be able to weigh in on these critical decisions. Supporters of this amendment argue that the objection process is overused and abused, but it's there to make sure that everybody has a voice in the process. I oppose this amendment. I urge my colleagues to oppose its adoption, and Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, if the opposition prevails, the Sierra, 400 square miles of it anyway, will be consigned to scrub brush and disease for generations to come. We've bent over backwards with the opposition to work out this compromise, and their continued opposition is quite disappointing. I repeat, the time is of the essence. I beg the Senate and the Democrats to take up these provisions without further delay. These provisions were developed with the full input of the administration and Democratic offices, but if they're still not acceptable, then tell us what is. But please don't just sit there and do nothing. The Forest Service estimates that 2.2 million board feet can be processed per day. That means every day we dither and delay, $250,000 of federal revenues is lost. That's enough to reforest more than 1,000 acres every day. But every day we delay, we lose that revenue, we lose those jobs, the salvage value deteriorates, and the wood and that window will start to close even before the litigation begins under current law. Just a few years ago, the private lands destroyed by the fire will have been fully salvaged and replanted a few years from now. They're going to host a thriving young forest. If we don't change current law now, the public lands will remain unsalvaged, and the millions of dollars we could have raised for reforestation will have been forfeit. Dry brush and dead trees will be the legacy of the Sierra that we leave our children. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Forest Service, as we speak, is preparing to authorize salvage operations on 30,000 of the 154,000 burned acres, and a decision is due, and a decision as early as August. You know, as I said earlier, salvage logging is not without controversy, and the decision to authorize these activities need to be fully analyzed and fully transparent. Many ecologists believe that post-fire landscapes are an essential component of forest life cycles that provide critical habitats for wildlife and other essential ecological services. Rushing to allow indiscriminate salvage operations, as this bill intends, threatens the overall health of the forest. The planning process is ongoing under expedited emergency provisions set out by CEQ. Our national forests are more than timber factories, and we have a public planning process that ensures all uses and benefits are considered. This bill ignores that process, and that is why I repeat opposition to and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part A of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska seek recognition?
I have an amendment to the desk, Mr. Speaker.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 5, printed in Part A of House Report Number 113-340, offered by Mr. Young of Alaska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska.
Mr. Chairman, the Alaska Native Allotment Act allowed Alaska Natives to acquire 160 acres of federal land. Approximately 2,800 Alaska Natives served in the military during the Vietnam War, and because of their absence, they do not have an opportunity to apply for their native allotment. In 1998, Congress passed a law that provided certain Alaska Native veterans, Vietnam veterans, an opportunity to obtain an allotment. One of my constituents, Mr. William Alstrom, applied for an allotment in accordance with this law. During the war, he served honorably in the Air Force. Mr. Alstrom is a lifetime resident of St. Mary's, Alaska, a village of about 500 people, mostly Yupik Eskimos residents located in the lower Yukon River in southwestern Alaska. His family has a long history in the region, helping to settle the area and operating the first general store. During World War II, Mr. Alstrom's father, Fred, was a member of the Alaska Territorial Guard of the Eskimo Scouts, a military reserve component of the U.S. Army organized in 1942. Following a TB outbreak in 1954, Mr. Williams was sent to a boarding school in southeast Alaska with many other children from Alaska villages. As the Vietnam War escalated, he graduated from one of these boarding schools and promptly enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, serving his country. Soon thereafter, he left his wife and 2 children stateside and headed to Southeast Asia. During the war, the newly minted Sergeant Alstrom served in Thailand, preparing aircraft on their way to strike North Vietnam. On the completion of his service, Mr. Williams and his family returned home to St. Mary's, where he invested himself in his village and continued to grow and raise his family. Today, Mr. Williams continues to serve, this time as mayor of his community and president of his village corporation. In 2002, Mr. Williams applied for Alaska Native Veterans allotment he was entitled by law. Following an extensive application vetting process in 2009, the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, deeded him two 80-acre parcels located in the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge. With his deed in hand, Williams transported lumber and other supplies to one of his parcels on his skiff, spent countless hours clearing trees and brush, and finally built a small cabin and fish camp for him and his family to enjoy. Out of the blue, a few years later, the Fish and Wildlife Service realized the errors had been made by the Fish and Wildlife and BLM personnel, both in survey and an application approval process. Instead of being located in the general refuge lands, the two allotment parcels were located within a congressionally designated wilderness area. Conveying allotments in wilderness areas is prohibited by law. Similarly, making improvements to the land, such as constructing a cabin, cutting trees, or clearing bushes, is also prohibited. As a result, the BLM canceled the deed to the two parcels, plunging this Alaska Native veteran and the status of his allotment and cabin into a state of limbo. After this decision, Williams contacted me for assistance. To their credit, the BLM quickly admitted that both they and the Fish and Wildlife Service screwed up. Though after looking into their options, they also admitted they couldn't fix their mistakes administratively. In an attempt to resolve the issue, the BLM offered Williams two parcels of equal-sized land elsewhere in the region. While he agreed to accept one of the replacement parcels, a second parcel excluded his cabin. My amendment today would approve his application for the second original parcel, subsequently saving his cabin and fish camp for his family. Though two federal agencies are at fault, my Alaska Native constituent is one being forced to bear the full cost of their errors. The purpose of my amendment is simply to allow the veteran to retain the 80-acre parcel with the cabin on it at no cost to the taxpayer. An identical version of this amendment was adopted by voice vote with the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee held their markup on the Green Mountain Lookout Heritage Protection Act, of which the House version is included in today's package. As you well know, I'm no proponent of the fact that the federal government is the landlord of well over 60% of my state. Think about that, 60%. I generally oppose wilderness areas. I've often had an adversarial relationship with federal land management agencies. All of that aside, this amendment is not meant to make a statement against wilderness designation, but rather to fix a unique issue for a truly deserving Vietnam veteran. At its core, fixing issues like this is what we do well when we're sent to Washington to accomplish. Mr. Alstrom, like his father before me, served his country, this country, with honor and dignity, and he deserves similar treatment from this government in return. I hope you will join me today in fixing this unfortunate mistake and allow this gentleman and his family to move on with their lives by supporting this simple amendment to H.R. 2954. And I reserve the balance of my time. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. If no member is seeking recognition for opposition, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
So we have two roll calls at 11:15, the Grahava amendment and the Labrador.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2954, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2954 and has come to no resolution thereupon. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 11:15 a.m. today.
Well, the House gavels out after considering amendments to a bill that combines 10 public lands bills into one. We expect them to come back and finish up work with amendment votes and a possible motion to recommit before too long, but they are in recess, subject to the call of the chair. And while they continue in recess, we're going to take you live on Capitol Hill to a hearing before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. They are working on a postal reform bill. This is a measure from Tom Carper and Senator Coburn, a measure that's